Welcome to the inaugural Margaret Henry Lecture. My name is Rosemary Milsom and I'm the Director of the Newcastle Writers' Festival. This is a significant evening and I'm honoured to be your MC. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional country of the Wabakul and Warramai peoples and pay my respects to elders past and present. Margaret Henry worked hard to support the rights of Aboriginal people. She worked hard to support the rights of marginalised people everywhere, individuals and groups, people forced to live on the fringes. Her compassion knew no bounds, and while empathy has almost become a bit of a dirty word in recent years, I don't think she would have had any of that. I first met Margaret at university a long time ago. I was all about the causes, the environment, Amnesty International, women's rights. We got to know each other better when I worked part-time at the Wilderness Society, and she supported the fundraising effort for the campaign to protect Barrington Wilderness Area. And it's so amazing, but there's so many of my former Wilderness Society cohort here tonight, including some who've travelled a very great distance. It's like a huge reunion, and I think that was Margaret's strength. She brought people together from all walks of life. She seemed to be able to clone herself. She'd pop up at exhibition openings, supporting local artists, at fundraisers, at rallies. But not all of her good work was in the public eye. She did all she could to help people who had private challenges, me included. Naturally, she was among the first group of people who volunteered at the inaugural Writers' Festival in 2013. We're here to honour Margaret's legacy, which is quite profound. A small team of Margaret's friends, led by her daughter Kathy, have organised tonight, and we hope that this will become an annual event. So thank you if you've bought raffle tickets, donated money. It's all really important. We've had to pay for the venue. Marcus, thank you, has not accepted any fee for tonight, which is greatly appreciated. So I'm sure tonight is a bit of a celebration, but for people who loved Margaret, also possibly tinged with sadness. And one of the council staff commented on the photographs and said it's so nice to see her face. And there's that warmth that comes from having had conversations with Margaret and having known Margaret, and I think we all miss that. I want to acknowledge the generosity of everyone who's here tonight. You've all had some kind of contact with Margaret over the years. I'm sure you've got stories to tell. Hang around afterwards if you like. But first, before I introduce Marcus, Margaret's former colleague and one of her longtime friends, John Sutton, would just like to say a few words.
Thanks, Rosemary, and I'll take the acknowledgement of country from Rosemary as speaking for me as well, and acknowledge the close relationships that Margaret had with the Indigenous communities of this area. I'd also like to recognise in the audience that there are many people here, and it's wonderful to see so many familiar and friendly faces, many people here who should be recognised and acknowledged, but I'd particularly like to acknowledge the presence of Keith Parsons, Margaret's partner. Give him a call. Catherine, Margaret's daughter, who's been, and Keith and Kathy. Keith and Kathy have been on the committee that's organised this, but I was also really pleased to see the rest of Margaret's children, Alison and David and their partners, and in some cases their children, who've come specially to this occasion. So give them a cheer too. It's wonderful to see Margaret. I want to say too how honoured I feel to have been given this opportunity to reflect on Margaret's legacy by the committee. As Rosemary said, Margaret was a close personal friend of mine, and as well as the personal relationship that I had, I recognised in Margaret a truly great Novocastrian. And her passing has left, I think continues to leave, a gaping hole in the civic life and the social change movement, the progressive social change movement of this city. I want to focus mostly on Margaret's contribution as a proud and avowed activist. She never worried about that term, she took it on proudly. But we should recognise that she made other substantial contributions too. I notice there's this lovely obituary from the Sydney Morning Herald that's been distributed. It has quite a number of these things in it. But it's impossible to fit in the time I've got to list all of the things that really are to do with her legacy, but we should recognise that she did make substantial contributions as a historian in the form of, for example, historical monographs about local history and a large collection of oral history that's associated with her work at the University of Newcastle. Margaret gave 6 decades of passionate, fearless, indefatigable commitment to this city. She was involved in issues that range from care for people with disabilities, Indigenous issues, women's rights, built heritage, history, arts and culture, the list could go on. She was, as probably most of you know, posthumously made a Freeman of the City in January 2016 in honour of that contribution to public life. Those who had anything to do with Margaret would know that she could be blunt, quite brutally blunt at times, and she certainly never shirked controversy. If you ever left a conversation with Margaret wondering what she thought about someone or something, you just weren't listening. And that particular trait and the reproval and even acrimony that often goes with people who speak truth to power did earn her many enemies and detractors who were quick to brand her with derogatory labels like whinger or naysayer. In fact, much of Margaret's personal life, as Rosemary's already observed, was spent helping people who'd fallen on hard times in various ways. And there are countless stories out there, some of you I'm sure have them, of heartfelt testimonials from grateful recipients of her care and kindness, which often change people's lives. People often say that about Margaret, she changed my life. And these aren't the stuff of news headlines, but those who knew her best were well aware of this side of Margaret. And her public life was often also about helping people, whether it was in the form of shepherding through Newcastle's Council's disability access initiatives, in which she played a very formative part, or helping out young people's theatre after fire gutted their building in 1995. I can remember Margaret calling me up straight after that had happened, what can we do to help? We were both councillors at the time on the council. And many other positive social, environmental initiatives that she was involved in all of those years of her activism. But it's true that much of Margaret's activist life was spent trying to prevent bad things from happening. And Margaret was no Pollyanna. She had a finely tuned and well-practised sense of outrage and a determination to transform that outrage into action. If something looked like it might happen that she thought shouldn't happen, she was right there on the front line. From the destruction of heritage buildings in the aftermath of the 1989 Newcastle earthquake to more recent controversies like the Layman Street trees in 2012 and the even more recent destruction of our railway line. Margaret for many years was literally a sentinel of the city. She lived for many years in Church Street in an apartment overlooking the city, and I can remember many times looking out with her over the balcony over the city, over which she was a sentinel ready to spring into action when needed. In the early 1990s, Margaret founded Save Our Rail. And that organisation, as I'm sure most of you here know, withstood a relentless campaign for more than 2 decades, led by local development interests to cut the Newcastle rail line, ultimately successfully, as it was sacrificed at the altar of vested interests by a captive and incompetent state government under the guise of revitalisation, amid all those reams of dodgy documents, corrupted processes and cash-filled yellow envelopes for local politicians. Margaret took her outrage about this to her grave, and I've got no doubt that she's rolling in it right now about what's happened since. I wouldn't be doing justice to Margaret's legacy if I didn't talk about these things and some of the other things that did or would have outraged her. Margaret was a strong believer in government and democracy. These days, by all measures, people's faith in the institutions of government around the world is currently at seriously low levels, and this disillusionment is both the cause and the symptom of a pervasive crisis in democracy itself. I don't want to start stealing Marcus's thunder talking too much about democracy, but we do see this everywhere, from Brexit to the election of people like Donald Trump who are manifestly unfit for public office, and even in the tacit or even active support for the appallingly inhumane treatment by governments, including our own, against refugees in flagrant defiance of their human rights, which is one of the supposed foundations of modern democracy. At the local level, it's reflected in matters such as the continuing failure of Newcastle's Labor-dominated council to implement election commitments to improve local democracy, and the council's recent decision to adopt a confidential proposal to shift council meetings from City Hall to the new City Administration building without any community consultation. Now, some of these things hadn't happened when Margaret was with us, but it's not hard for those of us who knew her to imagine how she would have responded in these cases. I can just imagine the outrage that Margaret would have felt if she'd been around when the news broke that Newcastle council officers had negotiated a formal agreement with the supercars company to prevent elected councillors from accessing information in their contract with supercars, and at the apparent failure of the elected council to do anything about this even after this was known. Margaret knew the value of dissent in a healthy democracy, and her outrage about such matters spurred her to take action and inspired others, like me, and I'm sure like others in the audience, to also take action. I want to finish by observing another characteristic that Margaret had, and that those who knew her well knew about, and that was her devilish sense of humour. I do fancy that Margaret, I heard her voice in my mind as I read about this recently. I'm sure she would have shared a hearty laugh at the ironic appropriateness of the acronym that has emerged from Newcastle Council's recent rebranding from NCC, Newcastle City Council, to, and I quote the council's own public statement here, a name befitting the city's stunning revitalisation, quote unquote, and the acronym is City of Newcastle. A stunningly appropriate acronym indeed, befitting much that's been perpetrated in this city in the name of revitalisation during and subsequently to Margaret's time with us. Margaret, I know, would have dined out on that one for a very long time. She was an amazing Novocastrian. It was an honour to know her and to have her in the city, and we miss her dearly. And thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you, John. Marcus is going to speak for about half an hour, and then he's happy to take questions from the floor. So there'll be a microphone that'll roam around. If you can put your hand up at the end if you have a question for Marcus. Also, there might be a little bit of time to buy a raffle ticket at the end as well. So if you haven't bought one, we'll announce the winners before we walk off the stage tonight. So maybe during question time, there'll be some lovely women walking around with folders who will happily sell you some more raffle tickets. Well, we not only export coal from Newcastle, we export talent. Marcus Westbury is a broadcaster, writer, media maker, festival director who's been responsible for some of Australia's most innovative, unconventional and successful cultural projects and events. He's one of those enviable people, if I could just get my mouth to work, who can do whatever he sets his mind to, and not only that, he takes other people along for the ride. Kind of a lot like Margaret. In 2008, Marcus founded Renew Newcastle with his own funds and countless sleepless nights. When a project is successful, we very quickly forget those initial challenges. We're kind of always looking forward. But there's always that core group, often one individual, who had to do all the heavy lifting in the beginning. Margaret was one of Marcus's champions, and we all need those, especially when dealing with bureaucracy and naysayers and our own self-doubt. Marcus is now leading a development of the Collingwood Arts Precinct, and he chose the topic for his lecture tonight: Community, Democracy and Change, Reclaiming Newcastle's Future. I have no doubt it's going to be nuanced, but pointed. Welcome, Marcus Westbury.
Thank you, Rosemary. I was reminiscing with John that last time I saw him was at Margaret's funeral, and on the way out, as the funeral was coming to an end, John stood up and started a rousing round of applause. And after what had been a very solemn ceremony, and a rightfully solemn one, I think it was appropriate. It was what she deserved, and I was so pleased to see that happen. And I'm honoured to be here tonight. I feel not entirely worthy of this honour, but hopefully I'll be able to do it justice. First, I'd like to thank and acknowledge Catherine, Alison, Keith, the Henry family for the invitation and the honour to be part of this and pay tribute to Margaret tonight. I've actually been amazed as I've walked up. So many old friends, colleagues, associates, people that many of the people in this room are my formative heroes when I was growing up and coming of age in Newcastle, so it's so fantastic to see so many of you come out. Margaret Henry was an icon. I'm proud to say that I knew her better than most, but certainly not as well as many of you in this room. For me, she was a friend, she was a mentor, someone I deeply admired both professionally and personally, and Margaret was as committed an advocate for Newcastle as there has ever been. She was passionate for a vision of Newcastle that was just, that was fair and decent, owned and driven by its community, proud of its history but unafraid to acknowledge its faults, and someone who believed that Newcastle's future would be strongest if it was built upon those values and that understanding. There are few people in the history of Newcastle that have put as much service over as long a period of time in pursuit of their vision for what this city should be as what Margaret has done. Also, of course, Margaret was a deeply polarising figure. I'm sure many of you would not have always agreed with her. Given that you're here, I suspect that most of you respected her conviction, her courage, her perseverance. There are times in my life where I wish I could be as strong as Margaret. I cannot begin to imagine how tough it must have been to endure not just the barbs and arrows that come with the cut and thrust of politics, but criticism that was sexist, ugly, vitriolic, nasty. I first met Margaret in the early 1990s. Back then I was a dreadlocked, borderline feral communications student. I interviewed Margaret for a story for Opus, the university student newspaper, and that story, oddly enough, was about the rail line. Today, when I say about the rail line, most people immediately assume I'm referring to the unwavering campaign that Margaret has waged over many years to save the rail lines of the city. But actually, back in 92 or 93, whenever that story was written, it wasn't about saving the rail in Newcastle, it was actually about expanding it. Back then, Margaret was a prominent community leader of the campaign to build a train station at Newcastle University. This probably won't be the last time tonight that I note how raw a deal Newcastle has received, but the idea that a campus with tens of thousands of students, probably one of the city's largest employment districts and precincts, did not have a train station was quite frankly an embarrassment. 30 or so years earlier, the campus site had been selected partly because it had a rail line running up next to it. I remember sitting in classes where you could look out the window and you could see the train going up to Maitland, but you couldn't get on or off it. Back then I was a student, I was living in the city, but I'd also grown up in Waratah West, so that station would have been my station. So naturally it was an issue close to my heart, and I realise in hindsight I think that may well have been the first article I ever wrote. They say you start by writing what you know. It was one of the first pieces I ever had published, but I'm pleased to say that a couple of years later, after a little bit of direct intervention and activism where students took to actually standing on the train lines and stopping the trains, a couple of stunts and other bits of political campaigning, and only about 30 years too late, the Warrabrook station finally opened. Unfortunately for me, it was exactly at the point where I flunked out of Newcastle University for the second and last time, so it became a little too late for me to really take advantage of it. Nonetheless, it's one of those little forgotten bits of history too, and one of the many things where Margaret's legacy is written into the infrastructure and history of the city. I really crossed paths with Margaret and got to know her a few years later. I was young, I was long-term unemployed, and I was part of a small community that was variously trying to change the world, stave off boredom, impress girls, and ward off desperation by creating arts festivals, creative projects and events in the community. Half a dozen of us in 94 or 95 took on the lease in an old warehouse in Newcastle West. A few of us illegally took up residence in a place that you weren't allowed to technically live in, out the back, and we turned the front into a bit of a low-budget DIY community centre. Back in 1995, we laid down the groundwork for Octopod, Newcastle Friends of the Earth, the first Newcastle Fringe Festival, and the seeds of what would then, a few years later, become the This Is Not Art Festival. In those early years, Councillor Margaret Henry, as she had became a regular and enthusiastic fixture at our events. She came to our talks and our film nights, our exhibitions and our openings. She was at our workshops, she was at our events. Margaret was nowhere near as intimidated by this motley crew of 20-somethings as we were by her. It took a little time and a few paranoid conversations before we realised that Margaret, although on council, was not from council. She was not an inspector, obliged to shut down our illegal residential occupation and our questionably licensed public events. She was a passionate supporter. Margaret was the first person of authority to show any interest in us and what we were doing. It was a passionate, giving, generous and enduring interest. Through Margaret, I came to imagine that the city believed in and appreciated what we were doing and what we were trying to do. Without her support, it's impossible to imagine that I would have kept on doing it. Some of my most vivid memories are of her taking me under her wing. She dragged me, somewhat reluctantly, from council office to office, barging in on council staff and introducing me to other councillors, several of whom are here tonight, and I'm very pleased to acknowledge you all. Making countless phone calls on our behalf, talking me up to anyone who was interested enough to listen, and quite a few who weren't. That support was critical to the establishment and the sustainability of Octopod, and later This Is Not Art. It was one of the primary reasons why that festival, which has introduced, I guess it's almost generations plural now, of young talent to this city, and has long been one of the largest tourist attractions in Newcastle. Margaret was one of the main reasons why that takes place in Newcastle, not Sydney, and that it takes place at all. More importantly and more personally, she could see the value in what we were doing at a time that I don't think I could. She could see the potential of what we were seeing in the city at a time when I didn't. And she believed in me at a time when I did not. After a few years of these projects, when I got my first proper paid grown-up job with an Australia Council project in Sydney, Margaret Henry, Deputy Lord Mayor of Newcastle, was one of my referees. I'd spent 3 years off and on unemployment, bombing out of university, I had no real qualifications. Whatever she said to my future employer, it worked. I got the job and I never looked back. I know that I'm not alone. There are probably countless, John acknowledged it earlier, there are countless people here tonight, Rosemary acknowledged it earlier, who have been on the receiving end of Margaret's support and advocacy. She has nurtured so many people and so many things in this city. There are very few parallels. Of course, Margaret, as I said before, can be a little polarising. On more than one occasion, her ferocious support meant that she threw herself into battles on our behalf that we probably didn't need or want to fight. But I could not have had a better champion, a stronger supporter, and I'm honoured tonight to have the opportunity to publicly acknowledge that. In thinking about how to address this forum and honour Margaret's legacy, I try to think about what brought us together, where we differed, and I wanted to kind of speak, hopefully with the honesty that Margaret always did. Margaret and I come from different generations, different motivations, different life experiences. Margaret was a historian. She was a passionate preservationist. For better or for worse, I've been less interested in the past and more interested in the future. We were both forged by a deep passion for Newcastle. We are both of Newcastle. Neither of us would make sense. Neither of us would have been on the same path, I think, if we'd come from a different place. But we're also formed and informed by growing up in very different eras, with very different expectations by our peers, our gender, and the changing fortunes of this city and this community. We shared a sense of justice, a deep belief in the power of community, and a particular belief in the power, ability, resourcefulness and resilience of the Newcastle community. I don't think either of us ever thought that preservation and progress needed to be contradictory. It sits in a context of much more fundamental questions about equity and justice, winners and losers, and recognising that because something is new, it is not always better. Before I go any further, it's kind of important to acknowledge I have a very peculiar relationship with Newcastle. But it informed everything that follows. As some of you know, over the last couple of decades, I have maintained a very strange and somewhat unique relationship with this city. The pattern of my adult life has been largely one of having a day job in another city and a passion project in Newcastle. That job that Margaret was the referee for in Sydney was in Sydney. For the next 5 or 6 years, I worked in Sydney for the Australia Council and the ABC. Back then, I would catch the Shinkansen, as I like to refer to it, up and back every second weekend to start the National Young Writers Festival and then what became the This Is Not Art Festival up here. I tried moving back a few times. I came back for a year or so in the late 90s and a couple of years in the early 2000s. But I've always sort of struggled because I've never been able to find anything like stable employment here. In 2002, I moved away again, this time to Melbourne, and that's where I've lived since then. But Newcastle to me is a recurring preoccupation. In 2006, when I had a chance to write and present a TV series for the ABC, the first episode inevitably was about Newcastle. Left to my own devices for any length of time, my daydreams are about Newcastle. My ambitions are about Newcastle. This place has been so central to everything that I believe in and everything I've wanted to do. In 2008, bizarrely, coincidentally, exactly a decade ago this week, I was back here again. 10 years ago on Monday night, we had a public meeting just up the road at the lockup to talk about and go on to launch what would become Renew Newcastle. I had no idea back then just how much that would change the trajectory of my life, connect me again so deeply to so many things that are happening here, and how much it would make me reconnect with so many things that are happening in Newcastle. But also, over the last 10 years, I've had this sort of schizophrenic relationship. I'm both deeply enmeshed in things that are happening here through Renew, but also strangely removed. I don't live here. And Renew itself has been an exercise in walking a very fine line. Distance has allowed me to step back from a lot of the ebbs and flows of the politics that's taken place here. And I've had the luxury and, at times, the necessity of choosing my battles, disengaging at times when I possibly should have engaged a bit more. Been part in, part out, part activist, part participant, and part detached observer through the changes that Newcastle has been through over the last decade. Renew itself has straddled, sometimes easily and sometimes awkwardly, some of the deep dividing lines that run through this community. I vividly remember a night early in the first year or so of Renew Newcastle where I juggled back-to-back tours of the 20 or so projects we were running. The first group was Margaret and Keith and some of their friends and colleagues and residents, community activists. And immediately after, I had to do more or less the same tour for a group organised by GPT and the Hunter Business Chamber. They were both enthusiastically supportive, but I can distinctly remember thinking that if either of them ran into the other, it probably would have ended on the spot. Through Renew, I found myself in a somewhat unusual position of being a roaming ambassador for Newcastle, for Renew Newcastle and for Newcastle more generally. In the last few years, Renew completely unexpectedly has taken me to New York and London and San Diego and Beijing and Bangkok, Mexico City, all around the world. But more relevantly, I've also spent time and built relationships with councils, not-for-profits, citizens and community groups in places like Gary, Indiana, Detroit, Sheffield, Rotterdam, Lisbon, Christchurch, cities and places that, like Newcastle, are dealing with the aftershocks of economic and natural events and the changes and challenges of a post-industrial economy. Places confronting their own challenges and finding their own solutions, just as we've been forced to do here. I think that experience has brought me to observations and revelations about Newcastle that have variously made me passionate, ambitious, optimistic about the future of Newcastle. But equally, there have been times when deeper fault lines here have left me desperate, despairing about the dysfunction, conflicts and neglect that seem so core to Newcastle and its challenges. The more I've travelled, the more I've realised that Newcastle's a unique place. It's a uniquely beautiful place. It has an amazing historic character, and that character is one of Margaret's legacies. It's also powerfully resilient. This city has been knocked down and got up, knocked down and got up, knocked down and got up so many times. And I pride myself in being an Overcastrian and connecting to that history of resilience, but equally think it's incredibly unfortunate that it's had to be. Newcastle has also always been, in my experience, a creative and ingenious place. It's got a great DIY culture. And as much as I admire that resilience, that DIY culture, that diversity, the honest truth is it shouldn't have ever had to be. I believe Newcastle has been chronically underserved by governments of all levels, politicians of all parties. This city does not have the control over its own destiny that a city of this size and a place of this importance and a community of this value warrants. If I go right back to the origins of Renew Newcastle, I came back here in 2008, walked up and down the two main streets, and I counted 150 empty buildings. In any other city in Australia, that would have been a nationalist scandal. It should have been a national scandal. Newcastle's a bigger city than Canberra, Darwin, Hobart. The Hunter has a population more than 20% larger than Tasmania. Relative to those cities, Newcastle's infrastructure, its community, its being is chronically under-resourced and under-invested in. Art gallery, sporting facilities, public transport, you name it. Newcastle consistently gets less than what it has earned and what it deserves. Yeah, I'll acknowledge the New South Wales government spent some money on the thing. But there's been something fundamentally broken about the process. The New South Wales government can sell off the port, one of the city's most enduring and important assets that so much of this community is built up over such a long time, and then return a fraction, a third, maybe, of that into a take-it-or-leave-it piece of transport infrastructure. That's not how it's supposed to work. Too often, Newcastle is offered less than its share and expected to be grateful for it. It suffers for being in the shadow of Sydney, for being politically unimportant, and it's rarely, if ever, received what it's owed. Yep, it's legitimate to acknowledge our lack of political leverage has hurt us. I will say, don't want to be quoted, if it's politically awkward later. We've been too often neglected by the Labor Party who are in power. We've been treated with, at best, paternalistic, if not nepotistic, contempt by Conservative governments when they've dished out the scraps and expected us to applaud. I'm not here to call out politicians or particular political leaders or parties. I want to actually step back and zoom out. Newcastle's problem is not of particular politics, politicians, good or bad actors. It's a systemic one. It's a pet obsession of mine. I'm particularly obsessed with the unintended consequences of systems. Renew Newcastle, if you ever read my book or some of the stories about how it ended up happening, is an exercise in unpacking unintended consequences and trying to find a way around through them to create another outcome. The question that I ask is, why was saving our rail a cause that had to be fought here? This community has never had the power to make decisions about its political and economic destiny. It was a battle argued here without ever having the ability to be resolved here. If you accept, as I do, that there were at least two genuine issues, the profound importance of investing in and maintaining good public transport to the heart of Newcastle, and the genuine fact that in its dilapidated and underinvested form, the rail line created a barrier that cut the city in half, then the real question is, how do you reconcile that problem? For 20, 30, 40, 50, God knows how many years, this community tore itself apart over that question, but the problem was not that the question didn't have answers. When I first met Margaret, Doug was probably involved, some of the people in the room were probably involved. There were beautiful and well thought through concepts for how the rail line could not be a barrier, have crossings all the way through and things that would have probably well and truly solved at least one part of the problem. You could dug it underground, there's lots of ways you could solve the problem. But in order to solve the problem, the resources had to come from somewhere else. But not just the resources, the political priority, policy work. It all had to come from somewhere else. The problem is this city could not resolve the question here. As long as the government in Sydney was required not just to fund the answer, but prioritise the resources, invest in the policy and planning options to solve the problem, it created a stalemate that was destined to be perpetuated. Increasingly, sadly, the question was simplified in the way it too often is here. Are you for it or against it? Do you want change? Do you want stagnation? They're false choices. This is not a city that is confronted by choices that are about the future or the past, about stopping or going. Binary choices aren't real choices. They're ones where the community's never been consulted and the thinking has never been thought through. Yeah, I guess light rail was an answer. It was an expensive one that's not being implemented well or cost effectively, one that came down from on high and with a begrudging take it or leave it, this is what we're going to do and screw you kind of attitude. As long as the resources to implement the decisions that matter here are not here, the levers of politics and policy that affect what this community does and can be are not here, this community cannot control what it is and what it can be. My travels have reminded me that the system we take for granted here is neither logical nor inevitable. As I've travelled around the world, one of the sort of big shocks has been realising just how disempowered local government is in Australia. Newcastle is uniquely weak. Issues here are amplified because, frankly, too often the other levels of government are just missing in action. They're not here. And then disempowered local governments are invested with all responsibility and no power to solve problems that anywhere else would be better resourced and better invested in. On top of that, you throw in the constant scrutiny of daily newspapers, radio, television, etc., and we end up in a political dynamic that does not serve us well. I've been to the US. Over there, some of these are good, some of these are bad. Councils run schools, they run healthcare. Transport, well, to the extent the US has healthcare. Transport, they can set minimum wages, have the capacity to invest in public housing, public transport, to demand that developers put community contributions back into the community that they're developing in. In Australia, it's not unique to Newcastle, but in Australia, local government is incredibly disempowered. It's given powers at the behest of state governments who routinely take them away when they don't like the way that they are exercised. Perhaps it doesn't matter in an inner mid-Sydney regional council, but in Newcastle, where the rest of government is so badly lacking, the absence of the capacity to make those decisions and deploy our resources here really stands out. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Newcastle is alienated from the powers that govern us. Too often we are at the mercy of what is done to us by others. Right now, the New South Wales government minister or parliamentary secretary responsible for the Hunter is not from the Hunter. It's a telling clue, and I've got to confess with Renew Newcastle, I've worked with Scott McDonald, who's the parliamentary secretary for the Hunter, and greatly appreciated his support. But this is a systemic issue, not a personal one. Today, there's not a single New South Wales Cabinet Minister or Parliamentary Secretary with an office in the 49 area code. In 3 of Australia's states or territories, Newcastle would not only be the largest city, but the hunter population would be more than 100% of the electorate. We get a raw deal. I don't have an answer, but I believe we need to move on from merely being defensive about Newcastle to being ambitious. We need a better formula for ensuring that the value that is created here is reinvested here. And as I've travelled around the world, there's a whole spectrum of ways you can get there from here. You can empower local government, you can empower local decision making, you can give real power back to the community. You can set up devolved structures, that they exist. UK have devolved a whole bunch of stuff out to the varying regions. Hell, we could secede from New South Wales. That nearly happened once. In the 1950s, there was an actual referendum, and only by, I think it was a 4% margin, that we didn't end up with the state of New England, which admittedly is bad branding apart from the Billy Bragg song, but that would have been incorporated the hunter up to the Queensland border. None of those are the right answer, but all of those are pressure points. And we need to pressure. Representatives of this community, of the hunter, of Newcastle, need to recognise, first and foremost, regardless of their political allegiances, this community deserves its share. On a really basic level, Newcastle deserves an investment that is proportionate to every other city of its size in this country, and if we don't get that, regardless of your argument about how it should be spent, I don't think you're doing your job. I think it will take a sustained and probably non-partisan effort to get there from here. But I also believe that by bringing power back to this community, it is much more possible to own and articulate a progressive vision for change. I am pro-change. I like change. I'm not very good at, as I said, I'm not a preservationist. I don't want to keep things as they were. The question I want to ask is, what are we going to be? What are we going to become? Who's it going to benefit? Who can participate in it? We need a change that isn't just about economics or investment or bloody apartment blocks going up. It's got to be about the core and fundamental issues of democracy and participation. We as a community must own that change. We must be able to shape it through our advocacy, through our actions, for Newcastle and for the hunter. Margaret was as passionate a person about this community as anyone I've ever met. I will never accept the suggestion that she was someone who was a naysayer, was against. I know what Margaret was for. She was for community. She was for diversity. She was for participation, democracy. She was for the idea that we all own this city and the place that we live in. She was for culture, for creativity. And she left an extraordinary legacy here. I only hope all of us can build on that, and that legacy won't be distorted and won't be forgotten. And I thank you so much for the chance to talk to you all for tonight.